are honored to welcome Father Bernardito Cleopas Uza, right, the permanent observer of the Holy See to the United Nations. And this is the first time in 15 years we've been visited by a representative of the Vatican. And this evening's format will be Father Uza to be engaged in a dialogue with Dr. Scorza. If you've been to Pathways programs before, you know how that works. They'll go back and forth with some Q&A up here, and then we'll open the floor to questions from our students and whoever else. And then we'll wind it down. So without any further waiting, I'll turn it over to Dr. Scorza to take us through the program. So thank you all for coming.
Thank you, Provost Kiernan. And thank you, Excellency Archbishop, for joining us this afternoon for the UN Pathways Forum series. I'd like to open our conversation by inviting you to make a few comments, and then the interrogation will commence.
Well, thank you very much for your invitation. I recall that you sent me the invitation for your fall program, but since I just arrived at the time and I was hitting the ground running, we might say, and so I was really not able to come. And besides, that was really the time also that I was in the Vatican for a meeting, the dates that you indicated, so I was not able to come. And thank you for your patience, thank you for your insistence. Otherwise, I would not be here. So I am, as you see, I'm not an American in that sense. I'm from the Philippines, actually. I was born in the Philippines, I was raised in the Philippines, and I was educated in the Philippines. And from there, I went to Rome for my further studies for my doctorate and for my diplomatic studies for the Foreign Service of the Holy See, or you commonly say the Vatican. And so I have worked in various countries. I worked for the last 25 years in Madagascar, Mauritius, Albania, Bulgaria, the United Kingdom, 8 years in the Vatican. In 2006, 2008, I was here as the Deputy Head of Mission. And then I was appointed Papal Nuncio to Haiti, 2008, until I came back to the UN as Head of Mission of the Permanent Observer of the Holy See to the United Nations last September. So it's more or less just to describe what I have been doing during the last 25, 26 years. And I think I should stop there, and I should rather have the questions of Dr. Sforza for me to answer.
Oh, thank you. If I may, I'd like to start with something very basic. I, for one, am a bit confused about what the difference is between the Vatican, Vatican City, and the Holy See. And I'm sure you've been asked this numerous times. Could you clear that up for us?
Thank you very much. Actually, I have not been asked so many very often.
Then I withdraw the question.
But thank you very much. When you hear diplomatic relations, you immediately think of countries. Countries, nations, characterized by what we call sovereignty, independence, autonomy, etc., subject of international law. But when you hear Holy See, we are not talking about a country, we are not talking about a territory, we are talking about an authority. When you see Holy See, it is a very ancient term. When you see Holy See, it's difficult to understand now because we are outside the Roman Empire context. And then we are, in the United States, we are outside what we call the Roman law or the Roman way of thinking. So when you say Holy See, for us now, we mean above all the Pope, his authority, plus the central governance of the Catholic Church. And that is what we commonly call the Roman Curia, or what you commonly call again the Vatican. But the central governance never without the Pope. So that's why we are called the ambassadors of the Pope are called papal nuncios. Papal, of course, because nuncio, again, is a very classical term. It's the old term for all the ambassadors of the Pope. So it is a special term only for the ambassadors of the Pope, which started to be used officially in the diplomatic language in the middle of the 5th century, of course, after Christ, exactly around 452, when after what they call the Council of Ephesus, the Pope started to accredit in a permanent manner his ambassador to the Emperor of Constantinople. At the time, it was still, of course, Byzantium. So we are talking about an old term, papal nuncio. So the Holy See is not a territory that we might define it in a negative way, but rather it is the Pope plus the central governance of the Catholic Church. Now the Vatican city-state, the Vatican was one of the 7 hills of ancient Rome, right? The Vatican is the only hill on the southern side of the Tiber. The Vatican Hill was not even an important hill in the Roman Empire, in the Roman Republic before the empire, because it was on the other side of the Tiber, although the Tiber at the time was very shallow. But it was used as a cemetery. So the Vatican is a hill. So when we say Vatican city-state, that's interesting that the Vatican, St. Peter Basilica, especially if you have been to Rome, and St. Peter's Square, under that, one of the most interesting archaeological findings in the world, especially in Rome, is that 4 levels under St. Peter's Square is an ancient Roman cemetery. But why is it that the Pope lives there now? You know, the Pope, after the fall of the Roman Empire, will start 312, 313. That's what he called when Christianity became a free religion. We call that the Edict of Milan, right? When Constantine won over his enemies, you might say his rival, and they signed this peace in which Christianity as a religion was now free to be exercised. Starting the time the Pope really exercised even temporal power. And the emperor also encroached into the spiritual powers of the Pope. Anyway, to make that story short, the Vatican city-state now is a very recent creation. If the papacy is almost as old as Christianity, that we consider St. Peter, the head of the apostles, as the first pope, as you know, he died in Rome. The Vatican city-state was born only in 1929, February 11, 1929, to be exact. Across centuries, the Pope had a territory. So actually, the Pope was a civil president, or a civil governor, or a civil emperor, or a king, if you might. And in 1870, I mention that because that is a very important date for the formation of the Vatican city-state. Until 1870, Italy did not exist. Italy was a conglomeration, we might say. There was no Italy, but just different city-states. You have the Duchy of Tuscany, you had Lombardy, you had the Republic of Genoa, the Serenissima, that is the Republic of Venice, and then in the middle of Italy, there was the Papal State, which was around 65,000 square kilometers. I don't know how that would translate into miles. Anyway, it was what is practically now around 40% of what is now Italy. So this was called the Papal State. To the south of the Papal State was the Kingdom of Naples and Sicily. So you had all these states until 870, when Garibaldi, you might say, united all these city-states, all these states into one country that we now call Italy. Now you're talking about 1870 and then 1872. And then it was even a monarchy before it became a republic. Anyway, that's part of the story. But when Garibaldi conquered or invaded the Papal State, the Pope did not recognize the country of Italy. So the Pope, where the President of Italy lives now, this is the Quirinale Palace, was the residence of the Pope. The Vatican, the Pope has never lived for a long time in the Vatican until 1870. And then, this, we might see, quarrel between the Vatican, the Pope, and Italy was not solved until 1929 in what we called the Lateran Treaty. With the Lateran Treaty, the Pope recognizes, because it is in vigor, recognizes the loss of all its territories and properties. So recognizes that Italy now is the legitimate owner of what used to be the pontifical state and all the properties within it. Now, in return, Italy recognizes the existence of the Vatican city-state. That is why we have the Vatican city-state. So if you look at these three elements, at least two here, the Holy See and the Vatican city-state, because the Vatican is now, we might say, a vestige of the Republican and Imperial Rome before the Christian era and the first centuries of the Christian era. So we're just talking about the Holy See and the Vatican city-state. Now, the Vatican city-state, in terms of international diplomatic relations, as recognized by international law, is not really a primary subject itself of diplomatic relations, because the Vatican city-state is just a very small 47-hectare territory where the Pope lives in total sovereignty and autonomy, but this autonomous, independent territory is just an instrument of the exercise of his authority. And that is why the Holy See, first, if we talk about modern diplomacy, the Holy See, in 1815, as you know, there was the Congress of Vienna. That is after all the wars in Europe, and France was defeated, and yet France was very instrumental in coming up with, we might say, the post-war order of Europe, especially. So in that Congress of Vienna, the Holy See it is the first codification, we might say, of really contemporary diplomacy. And the results, the document of the Congress of Vienna, of course, was revised, and what is now actual is the Vienna Convention of 1961 on diplomatic relations. In this is the Magna Carta of diplomatic relations in international law. In this document, in its Article 14, the Holy See is defined as having the capability, the legal capability in international law to receive ambassadors and all diplomats and all official legations, as well as to send ambassadors and legations to other states and to multilateral organizations like the United Nations. And in that, in Article 16, it talks about the deanship. The Pope sends his ambassadors. These ambassadors are called in English papal nuncios, or papal nuncio, or in Italian we call them nuncio apostolico. It's more Latin, we might say apostolic nuncio, but they are the same. So most of the country the receiving country of the ambassadors have the option when it comes to deanship, the head of the diplomatic corps accredited in that country has the option to have the papal nuncio as automatic dean, or according to seniority. Whoever, the ambassador who puts his foot or his feet first on the tarmac has the seniority over the ambassadors who follow. But in many countries, in all the countries in Latin America, for instance, except Guyana, anyway, Guyana, we don't have a resident papal nuncio. All the papal nuncios in Latin America, from South America, Central America to beside Mexico, because that's another, we might say, historical development. All the papal nuncios are deans, automatic deans of the diplomatic corps, as well as the one in Cuba, the one in Haiti, the one in the Dominican Republic, and in all of Western Europe, and most of Central Europe, and Eastern Europe, and some of the African countries. I'm mentioning that because The Holy See, as an agent, active and passive, of diplomatic relations, it has diplomatic relations with 179 countries and myriads of international organizations, among which the United Nations. So when you see Holy See, don't think of a territory, but rather think of a person, more of a person, that is the Pope. And then you imagine, you think that the Pope is, for us Catholics, he is supreme leader, he is the supreme authority of the Catholic Church, which is unique in the sense that the Church as the Pope as supreme authority of the Catholic Church has immediate legislative, executive, and judicial power. I mean, when it comes to the hierarchical, we might say, the hierarchical authority in the Church, the Pope, there is no division of powers. So that is why, for us, the concept of the Holy See as the Pope and the governance of the Catholic Church, the governments are never without the Pope, that is the Holy See. And in the Vatican City States, it's only 47 hectares, I guess. So, but it is enough for the Pope to exercise his authority with complete independence and autonomy from any other state. Yes.
I thought that was a simple question, but it was a remarkably nuanced and helpful answer. Let me follow this up with a couple of quick questions. When you are issued a passport,
Yes.
does it say Vatican City or does it say Holy See if you're a citizen?
Yeah, that's, I think he works at the immigration, I guess.
I'm just wondering.
It is both, because for my passport as a diplomat of the Holy See is a diplomatic passport. So when you are, you know that the Vatican has only around 700 citizens, and around 400 plus of that are outside the Vatican because they are the diplomats. That include myself.
It is the smallest sovereign state in the world.
It's the smallest sovereign state in terms of territory and in terms of citizens. And then those who are working in the Vatican, but who are not Vatican citizens, you know, those who are working in the Vatican would be, those who are working in the central organs of the Vatican, of the Catholic Church, which we call the Roman Curia, which is another very Latin term. The Roman Curia would be like your Washington D.C. would be. The Roman Curia would be your government, would be your Congress, and your Supreme Court. That is the Roman Curia. All of that are Vatican, but many of the Vatican offices are outside the territory of the Vatican, but they are housed in extraterritorial properties. You know, most of the Vatican properties, the majority are outside the territory, but they are recognized by Italy as extraterritorial, so their police could not get in. Anyway, to the question, there are so many people who work in the Vatican. Those who are working in the Roman Curia, very few of them are Vatican citizens. Even if they are not Vatican citizens, but they are not of the diplomatic service, they get the Vatican passport. So there are two kinds of passports that the Vatican gives: the diplomatic passport and the passport as Vatican city-state. We call that the service passport. But all those who are working in the Vatican retain their original passports because the Vatican recognizes at least double citizenship. For myself, I'm a Filipino citizen and a Vatican citizen at the same time. But the citizenship of the Vatican is not used solely. Nobody is born a citizen of the Vatican. The citizens of the Vatican are citizens by virtue of office. The Pope, when he becomes Pope, he becomes a citizen of the Vatican. But since the Pope is a cardinal, and since all the cardinals are citizens of the Vatican, then when the Pope becomes Pope, he actually has been already a Vatican citizen.
So there's no point in asking what happens if two Vatican citizens have a child, because that's not.
It's possible because the Swiss guards, the Swiss guards are Vatican citizens pro tempore when they are in service to protect the Pope when they are in service in the Vatican. All Swiss guards live in the Vatican with their families, those who are married. So there are a number of Vatican citizens who are families.
Interesting. Vatican daycare.
But you must be once the Swiss guard goes back to Switzerland or finishes his duty in the Vatican, then he loses the Vatican citizenship. Just like myself, I would be already a kind of a permanent Vatican citizen in the sense that I am already a papal nuncio. When we retire, we don't lose our title and we don't lose our passport.
I'm gonna make one more piece of mischief, and then we'll get into more substantive issues.
Okay.
The Vatican or the Holy See has membership in the European Union. Which is it that has membership in the European Union? Is it the Holy See or is it Vatican City?
It's we are not members of the European Union.
You're not?
Yeah, we are although our our mission to the European Union in Brussels is called an apostolic nunciature, because we are not a member, but we use the euro.
Yeah, I was wondering
Yeah.
about that because I have euros with Pope Francis
Yes.
and with other popes. So you're part of the monetary union,
Yeah.
but not part of
Not part of the political union.
union.
Yeah, we are the European Union. The Vatican has always since the papal state, the Vatican. We have a coinage, always as a mint, a mint house, mint factory, money factory inside the Vatican, and still continues to use it. So the Vatican uses the euro, but it's not a member of the European Union. Politically, yeah.
Let's move on to some substantive issues. You are the representative of the Holy See to the United Nations, but the Holy See also is not a member of the UN. Could you tell us a little bit about why the Holy See has decided to stop short of membership and be a permanent observer mission?
Thank you. That requires a long answer. Yes. Anyway,
We have time.
as you know, when the Holy See has always been invited to the General Assemblies of the United Nations really since its foundation. I saw letters of invitation 1952, 1955, 1957, etc. because I used to cover UN agencies in Geneva when I was working at the Vatican. And but the Holy See did not open a permanent mission to the UN until 1964. So in 1964, April 4, 1964, the Holy See became, we might say, really a permanent observer mission. You know that the United Nations was founded, the original members were only around 50 countries. And then, of course, most of the African countries became independent only in the late 50s and early 60s. That's why when the United Nations was founded, one of its most important councils was the Trusteeship Council, because really that was the kind of the body where which helped countries to become independent. And not only that, many of the countries who were already independent at the time, across decades, remained permanent observer states. They were not members. I could name some until the 1980s, the 1990s, especially the small European countries, they remained outside as observer states, like Luxembourg, Liechtenstein, San Marino, Monaco, and the last observer state was Switzerland in 2003. You know, Switzerland joined the United Nations as a full member only in 2003, so only 12 years ago. In 2003, then the Holy See found itself to be the only observer state. So we were asked what we wanted to do. So there was a debate. I was working in the Vatican at the time in our Ministry of Foreign Affairs, which we called Section for Relations with States. And there was a debate whether or not we should become a full member or not. And then in the end, and I remember they took the decision that we should remain as a permanent observer state, but all the things, all our duties and our responsibilities, our privileges, which we have always exercised from 1964 to 2003, should be codified in a resolution of the General Assembly. Because all these observer state countries, they were able to exercise responsibilities, rights, prerogatives, etc., across practically 40 years, but these things were not defined by a resolution of the General Assembly. So in 2004, Italy sponsored a draft resolution presented to the General Assembly defining all those things, codifying all those things in a resolution, and this resolution was specifically for the Holy See as a permanent observer state. And this resolution was presented to the General Assembly. It was the month of July 2004. And then instead of putting this draft resolution to a vote, the General Assembly decided to adopt it by acclamation, because the President said we will not put the Pope to the vote. Instead, he said we will just approve it, and everybody stood up and applauded. So that is how our status as a permanent observer is cemented, or has been cemented, and it is where it stands right now. Why did you say what? I think it's really a valid question. I understand why people ask us, because we are full members and even founding members of so many multilateral organizations, like the Organization of Security and Cooperation in Europe, like the International Atomic Energy Commission, etc. We are founding members, but why should not be a full member of the United Nations, which is the umbrella organizations of all the multilateral organizations in the world? The answer to that is it was really the decision of John Paul II. He was, tomorrow we celebrate the 10th anniversary of the death of Pope John Paul II. We now call St. John Paul II. And he was already sick at the time, but I remember that it was him who said that we will remain permanent observer state for a number of things, but above all, we want to be absolutely neutral on political questions. We could not alienate our friends by voting on political questions which for us are not fundamental. On the other hand, we cannot, that's one question. But how about if we have to make known our positions? There is no problem, because if you read the resolution on the permanent observer state, we have all the rights except two things of a full member. First is the right to vote, so we don't vote, which is actually what we want. And the second is we cannot present candidates to different UN organizations, bodies, or agencies. So those are the only two explicit limitations. Now, if we want to have our positions known, there is no problem, because we could submit all our papers, whether it's a non-paper or an official paper, to every body or organism of the United Nations. We could intervene just like the full member states. We could deliver our statements officially. We have a right to reply. We could organize conferences within the UN, like the full members, etc., etc. So all this, we pay our dues.
Not everyone does.
The U.S. pays only 25% every year. So from the point of view of, is it necessary for us to be a member, to be able to express, to convey what we believe in our positions on certain questions? And answer is no. So how could we maintain our neutrality in political questions and not to alienate our friends, to be completely neutral on political, especially quarrel among countries? We want to be rather mediator rather than voting for one side or the other. The question of the Falkland Islands or the Malvinas, the question of the Palestine and Israel, etc. These are highly political questions, and there are more than 100 resolutions at the UN every year touching on the Palestinian question. Could you imagine if we are a voting member, I don't know how many times we would have to alienate Israel or Palestine depending on our vote. Anyway, this is really, I mean, the core of the explanation why the Holy See decided to stay as a permanent observer state.
Thank you. That is very helpful. If I can go back to Machiavelli, since we're doing a little bit of a history lesson today. Machiavelli argued that no state could have influence, could be taken seriously, unless they had at least one of two things: military might or great wealth, and ideally, in his mind, both.
Yeah.
So my question to you is, no divisions,
Yeah.
no battleships, no air force, no airport. How is it that the Vatican, or if you will, the Holy See, exercises so much diplomatic influence in the world today?
Certainly, because the world doesn't agree with Machiavelli. Certainly, in terms of raw power, certainly Machiavelli is right. But you know what we Machiavelli, the political philosophy and the political theory of Machiavelli is something certainly that is extremely realistic, but not necessarily according to really the human conduct of interrelationship of human relationships. So that certainly brings to mind the question of was it the Lenin or Stalin? Okay, I couldn't remember. I think it was Stalin. So he was. It was already Stalin, not Lenin, because in the Soviet time already. And so somebody said, "No, you know, the Pope is saying this, and he's pleading to you or something like that for something." And Stalin said, "How many divisions the Pope have?" And of course, you know, the Soviet Union is gone, and we are still here. The Pope is still around. It's just to say that, you know, I think one of the I could have my theories. Others may agree or disagree. Certainly, it's very interesting that when the Pope lost the territory, when the Pope lost the Papal State in 1870, more and more countries established diplomatic relations with the Holy See, which was really something, just the opposite of what you would expect. The only country who closed its representation to the Holy See, you know what country? The United States. And anyway, you know the history of the Catholic Church in the United States, of course. It's a very checkered history, and at the same time, it's a history of discrimination. I still remember an old Monsignor, and I was working in a parish here in California. That was 1986, and he told me, when I was a young boy in the 1950s, when I was a young man in the 1950s, I saw, what's this, wanted, it's a wanted workers in one of the train stations of the Santa Fe Highway, railway in the West. And then after it said wanted workers, and under it said, I'm talking about 1955, under it he said, Catholics need not apply. So it's interesting because, as you know, that when John F. Kennedy was elected, you know, there was really that suspicion, very, very strong suspicion, that we should not have a Catholic president because he will take his orders from the Pope. This is, of course, a very if you situate it in the long history of especially of our relations with the Anglicans, that certainly is the word popish was one of the leading terms against Catholics in England, and then later on, of course, in the United States. I'm mentioning that because countries which did not have the same historical experiences in the United States, especially, of course, the European countries and the newborn countries in Latin America, they actually did not see the territory of the Pope as the main substance, as the essence of the capacity of the Pope to have diplomatic relations. They rather so, because this is a very long history. I mean, that question, I think my answer really is the historical development of the papacy and his authority. We know very well that at the fall of the Roman Empire, we are talking about towards the end of the 5th century, practically the papacy took over Europe. Practically the papacy was a kind of a counterpower with the Emperor of Constantinople. I mean, why did the Eastern Church, which were not called the Orthodox churches, and the Latin Church, or the Church of Rome, split? Because the Pope resisted against the will of the Emperor of Constantinople. And then with him, he brought with him part of Christianity, etc. So especially in the Middle Ages, if you look at the Middle Ages, the history of the wars in Europe, the Pope was always a power. The Pope was always the arbiter. Have you heard of the Treaty of Tordesillas? This is the Treaty of the Discoveries. When the Pope divided the world, half for Portugal and half for Spain. The Pope could not decide between these two Catholic powers, and of course they were rushing out, we might say. This was the time of the discoveries. We are talking about the 15th and the beginning of the 16th century. Columbus, remember, for instance, I'll give you just one example about this treaty. Why would the Pope be so influential? I mean, why would the King of Spain and the King of Portugal appeal to the Pope to arbitrate their quarrel? In 1521, Magellan, what they call, discovered the Philippines. The word discover now is very controversial. Anyway, Magellan Magalhães was a Portuguese, and he was sent by the crown of Spain looking for the spices. So he ran into the Philippines, to make the story short. Now he was killed there, and only one of the 6 ships was able to escape. And this ship, instead of going back to the Pacific towards Latin America, where they came from, it proceeded towards the east. And accidentally, they arrived in the Spice Islands. Of course, we know they're in the Malay Peninsula. And from there, they went back to Spain. So to go back to Spain, they had to travel through territories which were granted by the Pope to the crown of Portugal. And so even there, the Portuguese were running after the ship, but they were not able to catch it until they arrived in Sevilla, in Spain. I'm saying that because that's one of those historical precedences that we could see why the Pope across centuries have been so influential, even in political matters. Some of the last things, in 1984, 1983, Argentina and Chile almost really were on the verge of war because of the question of the Beagle. Now, both countries appealed to the Pope. So the Pope intervened, and in just a few months, they were able to sign the accord. They called it the Peace and Friendship Accord between the two countries, and the question was settled. And, if you look back and if you look forward, then you will find similar cases on why a Pope, somebody who doesn't have an army, somebody who doesn't have a territory big enough to hold even a small airport, could be or should be asked to intervene or intervenes. I think I could cite further, for instance, the question of Cuba and others, so many other, the question of Mozambique, the question of Angola, the wars in Angola, now Casamance in Senegal, and also the question even in Djibouti and the south of Sudan, they have all appealed to the Pope. Even in Algeria, countries where practically there are no Catholics. I mean, these are examples of, I think the question really is, I mentioned Stalin because that's also a very famous, we might say, question, how many divisions that the Pope have, so that I should listen to him. So I think that's also like, the United States has all the divisions, has all the powers, economic, military, and yet Castro listened to the Pope. I mean, that's one of the questions probably. It's very hard to solve why. I know the answer because we have been following that. We have been covering that for decades. And that is probably one also of the characteristics of the papal diplomacy, that it is very patient and it thinks in terms of eternity. So thank you. I think if that satisfies your curiosity.
It more than satisfies my curiosity. I mean, it seems that what you're saying is that by scrupulously maintaining a kind of neutrality, it actually enhances its influence rather than diminishing its influence. And your epilogue, the idea of having a very long view, is something that younger countries generally don't have the patience for, particularly young democracies, which want to see results today. But I'd like to circle back to your reference to Cuba, because when we heard the news initially that foreign relations were being renewed between Cuba and the United States. Well, first of all, a group of our students was there at the time, which was very exciting, doing study abroad activities. But then we saw the Vatican is involved, and we were like, the Vatican? Let me ask you two questions. Why was the Vatican involved? And to the extent that you can, what did the Vatican do to facilitate the warming of relations between two countries that have been engaged in hostilities now for many decades?
The Vatican has been working in that since 1959, practically. But certain, elements, elements have to be united, had to be present in order to achieve really something, to arrive at a certain brink of achieving really something. Or just, as we said, to go over the hill, or to be on the top of the hill. It's interesting, I know that, when I was a student at the Diplomatic School of the Vatican, there was a very old archbishop who used to be president of the Pontifical Academy, the diplomatic school, in the late 70s and 80s. And he used to tell us about his experience because he was the what we called auditor, or what we called he was the deputy papal ambassador in Cuba at the time that Batista's reign fell and Fidel Castro took over and communists took over. We're talking about the late 50s. And interestingly enough, Castro was educated by the Jesuits. He still loved the Jesuits. He said, the Society of Jesus, where the Pope belongs to. That order of Catholic priests, we call the Jesuits, or the Society of Jesus. And, he still, in some of his reminiscences and interviews, Fidel Castro always mentions the fact that he was educated by the Jesuits, by the Jesuit fathers. Anyway, so the papal ambassador to Cuba left, and he was, because the Holy See never interrupted its diplomatic relations with Cuba.
But there was seizure of property.
Seizure of properties, but our embassy, the papal nunciature, the nunciature was respected. And all the properties of the Catholic Church were confiscated, just like the communist era in Poland and Hungary and all these big Catholic countries. And so he said that he was there, and then he was also appointed as papal nuncio to Cuba later, because, he was already there, he knew Cuba. And he said that there were times, I don't know how many times, he said that during the night he would get a call from the palace, and he said, the commander, el comandante, would like to talk to you. And would you come? So he said that he would go there, and he said the comandante would just talk the whole night, and he was just listening until dawn. And I'm citing back because, again, that's the patience, and that already, I guess, looking back, I think it already really formed the basis of the trust that the Castros have on the Catholic Church and the Pope. And then, of course, the Pope, John Paul II, when they visited in 1998, and then Pope Benedict XVI also visited Cuba. But, these this is decades of work. The Vatican has never lost hope, if I say. It has always been open to conversations with the government there. The local church, especially the Cardinal of Havana, Cardinal Ortega Alaminos, he certainly is instrumental in that. You may not know it, but the Catholic Church in Cuba, of course, it was the big majority of the Cubans before the revolution were Catholics, probably almost 80%. And now, I don't know, probably or sometimes you say around 55, 60% are baptized Catholics. But the thing is, what I'm saying to say this, that probably you haven't heard of it, that the Catholic Church in Cuba have always been sustained by the Vatican and specifically by financial help from the Catholic Church of the United States through the Vatican. And, different ways of making it arrive there. But let's say for the last 10 years, I would say, the Vatican, the Catholic Church in Cuba had already had the liberty even to give business classes, basic business classes to young Cubans. You won't read it anywhere. But this was a proof also that this confidence, that this trust of the Cuban government when the Pope says, could you do this, we would like to do this, etc. You should forget, you should not always get mad. Get mad, but be practical. Think about your country in the long term. All this work, has been going on for decades. It's interesting that when Cuba, last year or a year and a half ago, changed the law and makes it possible now to have small businesses, private property, then we know that the Catholic Church had already trained hundreds of young Cubans to be able to run small businesses. And it's only that. The Pope has always expressed admiration to some good things of, the system. In spite of, of course, the fundamental freedoms could not be, denial of fundamental freedoms is not acceptable. But at the same time, you also recognize that there are certain aspects. It's good. Like, for instance, Cuban doctors are almost everywhere. There are more Cuban doctors in Haiti than Haitians. Probably there are more Cuban doctors in Bolivia than Bolivians, and so many Cuban doctors in Venezuela.
And they were the first to respond to the Ebola outbreak in
Yeah,
a systematic way.
I think I have an ally here. Thank you.
I'm just saying.
Professor. Yeah, it's very true. Can you imagine, the biggest, contingent of doctors after the earthquake in Haiti in 2010 was the Cuban contingent, because they already had 1,300 doctors and nurses in place before the earthquake. But, this is to show that, and Cuba has given 1,000 scholarships to Haitians to become doctors. And that number has already been fulfilled around 3-4 years ago, and they still continue. So around 1,300, 1,400 Haitian doctors have actually become doctors, not only through the help of Cuba, but in Cuba. They have this famous medical university in Santiago. But these are the aspects that the Holy See did not fail to mention, because if you look at Cuba, especially in the 1990s, in the 80s, Cuba had a better medical system than many other countries of its economic size. And education is universal. The level of education in Cuba was high. So when the Pope went there in 1998, he did not fail to mention this. But of course, without saying that, that the fundamental freedoms have to be respected. So in a sense, these were building blocks until, of course, and then there was the question of the exchange of liberations of, Americans imprisoned in Cuba and Cubans imprisoned in the United States. And then there's the question of Guantanamo. The American government secretly asked the help of the Holy See if they could find governments who are willing to accept some of the prisoners in Cuba, in Guantanamo, and that we have helped. And because of the Holy See, some countries were able to help. So these are also, on the side of the U.S., there is also these, practical steps at the same time. It's not really, as we call in Latin, do ut des, that's I'll give you so that you will give me. But, it's one of those practical aspects of diplomacy which does not necessarily condition what you can do for others, but which are helpful. A real, we might say, selfless diplomacy is that really you'd be able to help countries and peoples without expecting a reward or expecting something in return. That is beyond diplomacy, but that certainly is an essence of diplomacy too.
We do find in most of the conversations we have in this forum that national self-interest is never very far away from the conversation, even if we're not discussing it explicitly. Are there still such pressures on the Holy See, even though you're clearly a very different kind of state?
There are still, it is still very strong, and it is probably even clearer and more evident at the United Nations level, because that's where we might say interests of each country could really be seen by the positions of their statements, by the positions they express, especially at the Security Council. As you know, the United Nations is, at the end of the day, is the Security Council, because the Security Council is the only body of the United Nations that can make binding decisions. All the others are soft laws, or what we formally call non-binding resolutions or non-binding decisions. It is interesting that when it's always useful to cite cases in order to recognize, in order to identify why solutions to certain problems are just why some problems are just intractable, why solutions couldn't be found, even though it's so obvious, it's right there in front of you, but it just couldn't be applied, because the countries who make decisions have differing personal or national interest. Look at the Middle East. This is in international law practically, it really, justifies international intervention. Whether it's from the international humanitarian law, whether it's what we call the responsibility to protect, all those horrible things, crimes, these are war crimes already, atrocities, mass murders, etc., violations of fundamental human rights in the Middle East. All this would warrant an intervention of the international community. But why does the international community, why has it been so far impotent and does not even say a word almost? Because the countries who make decisions have their own political agenda. Again, very concretely, look at Syria. Why Syria has become really, it's very undiplomatic to say that Syria has become a battleground, although it is. Of course, their president has something to do with that, but Syria. Why is it that more than half of the population of Syria need humanitarian aid? That's around 12 million out of 23 million people. 7.5 million of those are displaced, and 4 million are outside the country. Could you imagine? Just imagine the United States having the same capacity as Syria in the same situation, but with around 200 million refugees. Do you think you could stand it? You would even complain with a few thousands in Rio Grande Valley, in McAllen, or in some places there in the south. So that's the situation there. But why can't the international community intervene? The United States, Turkey, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, they are all against Assad. But Assad is there because Russia, China, to a certain extent, Iran, they are supporting him. So call it a proxy war, it is. Call it a victim of the interest of specific countries who make decisions, it is. You know very well the P5, I mean, the 5 permanent members of the council, just one vote of the 5 is enough to scuttle everything. So if Russia is in favor of Assad, it doesn't say that, but it's always couched in these very beautiful diplomatic expressions. But that is, it wants Assad to stay because he is the legitimate authority. We always go to that. And the United States and Turkey would say he is not legitimate anymore because he is killing his own people. So one of these 5 countries would say, no, we are all just watching helplessly. That is how national interest, geopolitical interest, unfortunately until now, determined in a very, very strong way how the world confront problems of peace and security, or even commerce, business. I mean, the international business law certainly is not equitable to all. That's for sure. I mean, if you look at that's why Pope Francis has always been criticized, especially in the United States, if you ask Rush Limbaugh, that the Pope is a communist, et cetera, et cetera. I think, well, I'll stop there, because otherwise...
There's probably biblical support for that kind of position. I guess what I was driving at with my question is, okay, let me give you an example. You're part of the Euro monetary union. That must establish a sovereign interest in what happens to the euro.
Well, not really. In a sense, it's I get, my salary is in euros, so it has a personal interest in me.
Right.
I get less dollar for my euro now. It's actually 3 months ago I got $1.36 for my euro. Now it's really 1-to-1. But the thing is, the Vatican has the euro, but it doesn't have the accord or the agreement with the eurozone, with the European Union, with the European Union countries using the euro. It has a bilateral accord with Italy. So we might say, Italy, the money circulating in the Vatican is a kind of an extension of the Italian quota, we might say, of the euro. So in that sense, but it is an interest to us. But we have such a minimal,
pizza, you're still paying in
the
euros
euro
that are worth less than they were a year ago.
If you buy pizza here. But if you are in Rome, really, it doesn't matter. It doesn't make a difference in the sense that my euro is always the same euro that I would pay for the pizza now or in January. But it's different when I buy the pizza here, because if the pizza here is $10, I need 10 euro. But if it was $10 before, I only needed 7 euro before. So that makes a difference when I'm outside the eurozone. Having this, the devaluation of the euro has that effect, and I have that interest.
International
it's my personal interest.
Pizza arbitrage.
But I would not cry over it. Anyway.
Well, I think that somewhere there's a doctoral dissertation here: the nation without self-interest. Because it is unlike any other, if what you're saying holds up, unlike any other nation. Let me turn to a subject that I'm reluctant to raise, but I think it's important that we do, which has to do with some of the things that go on in the UN. You mentioned 100 resolutions against Israel. We're kind of used to that. There were, though, 2 reports last year published by committees of the UN, which were very critical of the Catholic Church regarding its handling of allegations of sexual abuse by clergy. In your role as papal nuncio at the United Nations, is it your role to wrestle and grapple with that issue within the context and framework of the UN?
The question that question was raised in Geneva, so it was our permanent, my counterpart in Geneva, who had to respond to the allegations, to the criticisms. But we gave the formal response to the Secretary General, who's here, and because certainly so many of the, we might say, the legal framework of this, what we call monitoring bodies, and especially the reports, the rapporteur went beyond their, we might say, mandates, And so we wrote to the Secretary General on that. But yeah, in terms of, there are certainly questions that we have, we may say we have differences with, not necessarily, the United Nations Secretariat is kind of neutral. It is rather the member states. Yeah. So and then that question, of course, for us, as the Pope said, it is certainly the most, probably the tragic in recent memory of the Catholic Church. But if you look at it in perspective, because any one scandal would be enough just to make everybody be horrified. So, of course, most of the cases happened in the 1960s especially, or even before that. The one in Ireland was case in point. I was desk officer for North Europe in the late 90s into 2006. And I was, we might say, when I looked into the documents, it's interesting that most of those happened in the 1960s and early 70s, very few after the 1980s. So it was really, if you look at it in the whole cultural context of the time, it was also probably the most important crisis for the Catholic Church those times. Have you heard of the Second Vatican Council? It was called, convoked by John the 23rd, and which was, from October 1962 to November to 1965, towards the end of 1965, around December 8th. And, this is what we called the reform of the church. We call that the renovamento, aggiornamento, it was within the context of the hippies. It was within the context of really what we call sexual revolution. It was in the context of protests in all the campuses in the world. It was the context of the revolutions in terms of political systems. I mean, you imagine all the guerrilla warfares in Latin America and the Philippines, etc. In the Catholic Church, something happened parallel. That was the time when there was we might say an aberration in the understanding, that the church also has lost its limits. And these were most of the, the context of the time was really also the context of most of those abuses. Anyway, going back to that, it was the Human Rights Council which made that that criticism, because the Human Rights Council, there are every term, I think it's 3 years, there are around 52 countries that are members of the Human Rights Council. So this Human Rights Council appoints a called rapporteur, so people who give reports, and then each year there are countries who are examined. So last year, the Holy See was one of them, and that was where the problem was. Of course, that has died down, and we have made a response, but it was not me, it was my counterpart in Geneva. There are, we negotiate resolutions. That's one thing that, the Holy See is just like member states. I mean, we participate in negotiating texts. And the Holy See is a signatory to many international conventions. For instance, of all things, Non-Proliferation Treaty, the Treaty of Non-Proliferation of Nuclear Arms. We are an original signatory to that, to encourage the world to adopt this. Indeed, it was ratified in 1970, and next month we're going to have the 9th Review Conference. Anyway, there are texts which certainly, we do not agree with other countries, just like the countries among themselves, they do not agree with one another. Because again, there is what we call interest, if ever there is what we call interest. So for instance, the question of abortion. You know that the stand of the Catholic Church that we don't accept abortion. So when those texts are negotiated, of course, some countries, especially like the Nordic countries and some others, now, we don't agree with them. So negotiations are always carried, and so many, practically the whole of Africa would be with us. And, you talk about negotiations and same-sex marriage. I mean, the whole Arab world was just threw itself on the negotiations. So all these things are negotiated long before they would appear in public. And during this gestation, we might say, the nurturing of the text, then we are there to argue. It is very normal, and we make friends, we make enemies, and so it is not only when it is publicly known that we don't agree on certain things, but only also in the belly of the United Nations, in all those negotiating rooms, we are there, and we make also enemies and friends over there.
Interesting. I'd like to ask you one more question before we open things up to the audience. I'm curious about what is on your diplomatic agenda at the UN for the coming year.
This year, we certainly our priorities this year as Holy See are really also the priorities of the United Nations. As you know, the Millennium Development Goals expire. They will expire this year, and the goals were there were 8 goals. Now there are 17. We call them the Sustainable Development Goals. Before they were called Millennium Development Goals. Millennium MDGs, there were 8 now, the SDGs, 17. Some, again, these are very hardly, it's negotiated. It has to be balanced politically. It has to be balanced to the needs of developing and developed countries, et cetera, et cetera. So our big priority, just like any other, I think, delegation at the United Nations, is to negotiate this huge body of what we will call certainly the Magna Carta of Development in the next 15 years. It's called Post-2015 Development Agenda, which is the agenda for the development until 2030. There are 17 goals, 169 targets, and thousands of indicators, if you get what I mean. All this we have to negotiate. There is the question of the means of implementation. There is the question of financing these goals. How are you going to achieve these goals? The first goal and the overarching goal of this Magna Carta of Development is the eradication of poverty. If you remember the MDG, the first MDG was also eradication of extreme poverty. The world has not achieved that, but we are more ambitious this time. Eradicate poverty, which really in real terms, you eradicate the poverty of the 40%, 45% of the world's population, which in real terms would be around 3.7 billion people. But according to the statistics of the UN, there are only around 1.3 billion people who are extremely poor. When you say extremely poor, that means that person lives with less than $1.25 a day. Of course, it's an indicator. Poverty, poverty in Manhattan is not like poverty, I don't know, in Manila or in the village. So it's very relative. What I'm saying is that when the Pope comes in September, I do believe that he will focus, this will be one of the focus of his address to the General Assembly. There will be the summit. This is, we call that the summit of the mother of all summits, the mother of UN summiting, so you might say.
So no parking for anyone.
Yeah. So practically all the presidents and prime ministers and foreign ministers and ministers of development, they will be in New York in September. The summit will take place from 25 to 28 September. And the Pope will address the General Assembly in the morning of September 25. Although officially it's not part of the summit because, the General Assembly had just adopted a resolution to push the opening of the summit to 11 in the morning of September 25 to give 2 hours and a half to the Pope. So the Pope will actually address the same questions in front of the summit people, but in terms of protocol, he is to be outside the summit. So that's really our main work. I mean, it's a very big document. It's a very huge document. 2 weeks, 1 full week every month is dedicated just to that at the UN. And in July, half of the month will be dedicated just to that. So that hopefully by August, we should have what we call the outcome document that the heads of state during the summit would adopt. So that is. The second is climate change. Because, the Pope will release an encyclical, we call it an encyclical. It's really a document, an important document, just a high level of document. We call that encyclical. Encyclical is just, when you say encyclical letter, because encyclical is just another word to say universal. Just like when you say Catholic, it means universal. Encyclical, which means it's addressed to the whole world. Encyclical, which means it's not addressed only to the bishops, it's not only addressed to the priests, the religious, or the Catholics. It's also addressed to all the people of goodwill, as we would say. That's what encyclical. And it will be on the question of environment, climate change. So everybody is, everywhere I turn at the UN, they would stop me and said, what is going to Pope, what's the Pope going to say in that? And when is the Pope going to release that? I said, well, it seems to me that you are waiting for a new Bible. I said probably there will be nothing extraordinary in it, but there is that expectancy, there is that attention of whatever the Pope would say about these questions. I don't know why. It seems the world was just waiting for somebody to say something, and somebody who might appear credible to them. And they have found it in Pope Francis, or we have found it in Pope Francis, because every word he said, you will see it in the papers. So everybody is expecting that. The Pope has actually taken some weeks of retreat, in a sense, just to focus on that document. So that's it. And the third is the nuclear weapons thing. The Treaty of Non-Proliferation was adopted by the members of the United Nations, by the international community in 1968. This was the height of the nuclear race. And it went into force in 1970. And as I've said, the Vatican, the Holy See, is one of the early signatories of this convention, of this treaty, not because the Vatican is hiding nuclear bombs, but because, the Pope, the Holy See, really wants to encourage all countries to, on this very important question of peace and security in the world. The central promise of this treaty is that the 5 nuclear powers of the time will progressively disarm, while all the other countries who did not possess nuclear powers at the time should not seek to develop nuclear power. This is what we call the Great Bargain. This is the heart of the treaty, to make it short. Now, even though the treaty has been in vigor since 1970, it seems, if you permit me, there has really been a failure of this treaty. Not only that there are countries which have become nuclear power countries from 1970s and on, but also the original nuclear power countries did not only disarm, but they are modernizing their nuclear weapons. So that is, we are, as Holy See, last December there was the 3rd International Conference on Humanitarian Impact of Nuclear Weapons. In the first and second conferences, first in Norway and then in Mexico, the third one was in Austria, in Vienna. The United States, the UK, and the nuclear power countries did not participate, except France, because he said that it was, I don't know.
They were busy that day.
They were busy. They didn't believe in it. But this year, all the countries sent delegations. And in Vienna the Pope wrote a very strong letter to the conference, and the Holy See presented a very strong position paper on the moral argument, not only against the use of nuclear weapons, but also the possession of nuclear weapons. So there's a big difference there. We want to advance further the moral argument against nuclear weapons by putting that forward. And not only, if you, I wouldn't say if you remember, because I'm sure probably you have not even heard of it. In 1983, the Conference of Catholic Bishops in the United States released a document on nuclear deterrence, in which there was a kind of a pro-tempore justification of the position of nuclear arms in the context of what we call balance of power. That was still, the communist time. The communist Soviet Union still existed at the time, of course. Now we want to put another step forward by we won't accept deterrence anymore as a moral argument for keeping nuclear weapons. So that is that's our third priority. We are sponsoring a conference, if you're interested, on April 9, precisely to develop this paper in front of the UN, to the UN, and we will this is not, the scientific argument, the diplomatic argument about nuclear weapons and disarmament in general has been tried every way, everywhere, all high-level summits, everything. Now we are going to approach this question, at least at this time in our conference on April 9, from the religious point of view. I mean, our 5 speakers are all religious personalities: an imam, a rabbi, a bishop, a World Evangelical Alliance theologian, etc. So that's, I know how you see it. Certainly, it's to remember the generation of the 1960s. In 1960, in the 1960s, certainly I was a boy. I was in primary school in the late 60s. But I still remember, seeing all those pictures, Make Love Not War, with no nukes, etc., all these T-shirts. I don't know, the young generation of today are willing to do that and go out to the squares and no nukes or something. It seems that we haven't seen much of that recently.
It's the internet. Everyone's very busy.
Yeah. So those are, we might say, if I might say, those are really 3 of our priorities this year and the years, the next years. We will certainly, myself, we are working very closely. Last month I was invited to 2. It's interesting because I'm a diplomat. Certainly, at the same time I'm a priest. I'm a bishop. So at the UN, that's also how they see me. In the international community, that's how they see me. So at the UN, when there was a high-level panel discussion on the role of religion and sustainable development, and I was invited to be part of the panel. And then 2 weeks after that, I was invited by the World Bank to attend a roundtable on the same argument. So I asked myself, why should a huge international financial institution like the World Bank or the UN, which is a multilateral par excellence, would talk about religion as important in achieving development? I mean, and then, again in July, the World Bank, I'm not saying that it was impressed with my participation, the World Bank has asked me to moderate a panel on the same question with a greater participation. And then in July, I'm going to Ethiopia, Addis Ababa, for the 3rd International Conference on Financing for Development. So you may ask me, what is our line there? I mean, it's interesting that the other day in our intervention at the debate at the UN, you would observe, how countries approach the same question. And the question of how are we going to finance these goals so that we could achieve what we want or what is being fixed, what we have programmed. And all the developing countries, you will see that they would, above all, emphasize, first and foremost, an increase of what we call official development assistance, ODA. And then an increase of private investments from rich countries to the poorer countries. Now, if you listen to rich countries, they would always emphasize, first, before we give you money, we want an end to corruption and good governance. I think both are very good. I mean, so we try to be in the middle, and and then there is the question of the cultural aspects, the ethical aspects, the national law aspect. How could you achieve development? Are you going to force this goal, especially what we call the indicators and the targets? Because the goal, there is not much of a controversy. But how are you going to measure the success or the failure of a goal? You must have targets, you must have indicators. Now, this question of indicators is a huge debate because some countries would insist on certain indicators which they think are universal, should be applied to all, but some countries would resist. You say that is against our national law, and that is against our culture, etc., etc. So it's still a big debate out there. I'm sure, yes, that's part of our daily job over there. But I mentioned that because the question of economic models, the question of financing for development, the question of international economic financial system, that is also at the heart of our preoccupations, even though we don't have any financial interest.
Or indeed an economy.
We don't have an economy. You know, we don't even sell cheese or wine. You know, Italy would not allow that.
What is I won't ask you what your biggest export is, because I think we need to move in the very
Yes.
limited time we have
Yeah.
left to some questions from the audience. And I'll invite Sarah Horn, Assistant Director of Global Learning, to facilitate for us.
Thank you very much. So we have time for like a few questions because we really have limited time. He will come to you. I point to you. Raise your hand, please. Jamal will come with the microphone. Okay, first question.
We could hear you
Okay,
without the
now,
microphone.
now we're okay. Okay. Hello, I just had a quick question. We talked about how the Vatican might be a selfless country, but there has been criticism over the opaque nature of the banking protocol, especially in regard to its silence during World War II and the source of its revenue. So how does the banking industry affect your diplomatic agenda, and what is the nature of that industry, and is there reform on the way?
Yeah, thank you. I understand that you might think that the Vatican Bank is a huge player. It is not. It is not even an investor. But anyway, yeah, we call it the Vatican Bank. Officially, we call that the Istituto per le Opere di Religione, which is the Institute for Religious Works. This institution was founded, above all, especially after the Second World War, in order to distribute, to make, to facilitate distribution of aid, and at the same time, to have a place where the Vatican workers, including ourselves, could put their money in deposit. You know, we could have an accounts. That's what we still do. Certainly, there have been cases of scandals, and I think, especially under Pope Francis now, I mean, there has been really drastic solutions to this. First of all, the Pope created a centralized financial system in the Vatican now. They call it the Secretariat for the Economy, which really would be equivalent to your ministers of finance and economy. And then everybody at the Vatican Bank has been changed. So, and then just yesterday, I mean, it came out in our internal bulletin today, but you could also read it in the news, that the Vatican signed a protocol with the government of Italy on everything on financial matters. Before, this was not done. That's why Italy also complained, because there was a case 2 years ago, which really also was a cause of scandal, that the Vatican Bank deposited, it was not a big sum, 23 million euro, I guess, to a bank in Italy. And the Vatican Bank would not reveal to the Italian financial authorities what was the origin of the money. So now they have actually returned the money. So I think they were satisfied with the explanation. Because, there has been a very jealous, I worked in the Vatican, and so I more or less understand the reasons behind it. First of all, I think the Vatican did not expect the evolution of the Vatican Bank, or the evolution of its financial needs, or the evolution of its financial relationship with other institutions in the world. That's number one. Number two, the Vatican has been very jealous about its autonomy on certain things, including its financial and economic autonomy from Italy. So there was that very strong resistance. I still remember that 2003, 2004, that the Italian government was complaining. And then our prime minister, Secretary of State at that time, said that this was the Italian authorities did not have the right to impose itself on the financial matters in the Vatican. But of course now also the financial regulations have evolved. For instance, 2 years ago, the Manival has said to have been satisfied with the changes in the Vatican financial system, and it certainly is. It certainly is. I mean, I say it. I say this because I experience it. Not even because of my personal, accounts, but because of the accounts of the mission. We could not make transfers, or we could not ask transfers from the Vatican to our banks here as easily as before. They would ask you so many things. They would ask you a formula to fill up. Before, I would just send a fax, or I would just make a call, and they give you the money. So, in that sense,
I won't
yeah.
ask if the Vatican
Yeah.
Bank issues mortgages or credit cards.
No.
No, okay.
They issue credit cards, but they are not, what's this? They are not, they are, we might say, issued in the name of another bank. Now
Okay.
it's the Deutsche Bank. Yeah.
Next question?
I think there was a hand in the
Maybe
middle
here.
there.
So my question, like you mentioned, in September the Pope will be talking about the whole issue of climate change. But my question pretty much is that here in Florida, it was actually outlawed to use the word climate change. So what is the position of the Vatican in this
That's
issue?
within, of course, that term, I mean, I agree with you. You know, if you remember, in the 70s, there was the huge scare of global freezing, right? And then in the 1980s, there was this huge thing of global warming. And then into the 90s, especially now, you don't hear global warming anymore, but you have climate change. These are all the same things. So if you ask proponents of this at the UN, you know, what's the difference between global warming and climate change? Of course, you say immediately climate change is a neutral thing, whether it's global freezing or global warming, it's a change. But I say, you know, climate change changes as often as our daily humor, as our daily behavior. I mean, what I'm saying is, if you look at the literature in there, it would say that climate change is actually global warming. The Holy See uses it, of course, with caution. And you know, I think we use it because that's that's the official term in the debates at the UN. But really, we try as much as possible to emphasize it. We always want the word environment. We always want, the care and the love for nature, instead of saying, you do something because otherwise, it's getting warmer, etc. We don't go into the 2 Celsius, 2 degrees Celsius increase, and the world will die or something like that. We don't go that far. The basis of the Holy See position on this question. It's interesting that long before, at least 20 years before, the question of climate became en vogue at the United Nations level, churches, especially the Catholic Church, had already a long history of, the question of the care for the environment. In the 1960s, I remember, 67, Paul VI at that time wrote a very, if you read it, you would think that it was written for the UN today. And then that's it. I mean, say, we are not new into this argument. For us, it is something connatural, because the basis of our position, I mean, the fundamental treatise of why we have to care for nature, why we have to care for the environment, why we should, if we have to use the term, avoid climate change, although we could not avoid it because every day changes, is that it is a moral imperative for us. So whether it's global warming or global freezing, or the climate is, we might say, stable or constant, it is already secondary to us. Our primary concern is that we must take care of what we have. And then we have the question of stewardship, which is, for us, it's really more than scientific. Our approach to the question is really moral and theological. Of course, you start with creation. You start the responsibility of our responsibility, say, as stewards of this creation. So it is. We might say we go over the argument of 2 degrees Celsius or 2 degrees Celsius above or 1 degree Celsius or whatever. We go over the question of how much greenhouse effect that the United States have put up, or is causing, or China, etc., etc. So I believe, and then our approach is, well, how are we going to go about this? So it immediately goes to the question of personal responsibility. What would be the first suggestion of the Catholic Church on how to fight what we call climate change? The Pope would tell you, look at your own personal lifestyle. Why is it in the world there are just extremely poor people? Do you know now, let's say, if you talk about this, because, the question of climate change, it also becomes a question of global poverty and the inequalities. As you must have seen in the Oxfam studies, the 84 richest people now has the economic worth of the bottom half of the world's population, which means 84 people is equivalent to 3.7, 3.8 billion people. So if you look the question of climate, of environment beyond the question of degrees, etc., you would look into equalities. Say why are the poor people are the first ones vulnerable to climate change? And then those 84 billionaires, do you think that they care less about climate change? I mean, they could easily adapt, and they have what we call mitigating factors, mitigations. They could have a house, they could have a villa everywhere in the world, and have a fleet of yachts to go wherever they want, where the climate is okay, right? But
Okay.
how about the poor people?
Let's see if we can do 2 questions in 2 minutes, because if we go over time, we have to pay extra for the microphones.
Oh, really?
No.
I don't want that. I don't want that to happen.
So
Okay.
please, just 2 more really short questions, because we're already over time. Jamal, right here?
Quick question. Is there any situation that you believe that the Vatican City might have to give up a bit of their sovereignty in order to join the UN?
No, our being an observer state or a full member of the UN really that just depends on one thing: the decision of the Holy See not to become a full member, because whether we have sovereignty, the Holy See is a sovereign and a subject of international law. So it's not the question. The question is the Pope or the Holy See doesn't want to be a voting member. Thank you.
Okay, last question,
It's an option.
please.
It's a choice. Yeah.
Right down front here.
Oh, I'm scared. The professor
want-
is asking
You're
a question.
confronted by a Unitarian, I should warn you.
You gave me away.
Wow.
I want to thank you. You're so candid. You're so prepared. Whoever selected you obviously knows what they're doing, very much.
I hope so.
And I think we all should just be very grateful for your presence tonight.
Thank you very much, Professor. Thank you. I'm very grateful for the invitation.